The first sound that broke the hushed elegance of the ballroom was not the violin's bow gliding over strings, nor the tinkling of crystal against crystal. It was a laugh sharp, derisive, cutting through the air like a blade. Conversations stalled. Forks hovered in mid-air. Dozens of eyes turned at once toward the long banquet table near the stage, where a man sat rigidly in his chair, his wife beside him, her expression frozen. The laugh had not come from them, but was aimed at them, hurled across the glossy surface of white linen and silver. A laugh designed not to amuse, but to wound. Ethan Ward felt the heat crawl up the back of his neck. He was no stranger to whispers in rooms like this, no stranger to the weight of gazes measuring him, testing him, deciding where he belonged. Once, years ago, such rooms had belonged to him without question. His company had been hailed as the crown jewel of the city's skyline. His name carried weight. His signature closed deals. His presence commanded deference. But tonight, at this gala, among faces that once clamored for his approval, he sat with the eerie sense of being invisible except for the laugh that made certain everyone saw him for what they assumed he had become. Forgotten. Irrelevant. Unworthy. Across the table, a woman in a sequined silver gown tilted her head back, her diamond earrings swaying as she leaned toward her companions. Her lips curled, her manicured fingers brushing against the stem of her champagne flute. "Can you believe it?" she murmured loudly enough for several tables to hear. "That dress? That hair? She looks like she wandered in from the wrong event, entirely." The ripple of chuckles that followed tightened like a noose around Ethan's chest. The remark had been aimed at his wife, Lena. And though Lena's shoulders remained straight, though her eyes stayed fixed on the untouched appetizer before her, Ethan saw the tremor in her hand, the way she curled her fingers tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. The injustice of it struck him harder than any market loss, any headline scandal. This was not a faceless competitor or anonymous critic. This was cruelty dressed in couture, the weaponization of social standing wielded casually in public. He glanced around, desperate to find even a single sympathetic look among the glittering crowd. Instead, he found avoidance. Eyes flicked away when they met his. Some turned to their plates. Others raised glasses to their lips with exaggerated leisure. It was as if his pain, his wife's humiliation, were inconveniences too awkward to acknowledge. He wanted to stand then, to slam his hand on the table and demand silence, to remind them who he was, who they were laughing at. But his legs remained heavy, nailed to the marble floor beneath his chair. A kind of paralysis gripped him, one born not of fear but of recognition. This was how far he had fallen in their eyes. They no longer feared his power. They no longer respected his presence. They no longer saw him. Lena breathed in slowly, the way she always did when she felt the room closing in. She had grown up far from galas and crystal chandeliers, far from pedigrees and old-money surnames. For years she had navigated Ethan's world with quiet grace, never trying to outshine, never trying to conform, simply existing as herself, and Ethan had loved her for that. But tonight, her authenticity had become the excuse for mockery. Her modest navy dress, elegant in its simplicity, was sneered at because it lacked a designer label. Her gentle manner was mistaken for weakness. Her presence beside him was treated as evidence of his decline, and the people who dared to laugh did not even bother to lower their voices. Ethan's fists clenched beneath the tablecloth. Every fiber in him screamed to protect her, to shield her from the venom disguised as sophistication. He remembered the nights she had stayed awake with him, long after the markets closed, when lawsuits threatened to strip everything he had built. She had held his hand when even his boardroom allies deserted him. She had reminded him, in whispers and in silence, that his worth was not in numbers but in character. And now, here, in this room of chandeliers and silk, she was being made to feel small because of him, because of the story others had written about him, because of the perception that his fall had dragged her down too. The woman in the sequin gown laughed again, sharper this time, and leaned toward Lena as if delivering a joke across a garden fence. "Tell me, dear, did you lose your way to the charity raffle? I hear the church basement has better lighting than this ballroom." The cruelty was so casual, so rehearsed, that for a moment the room seemed to nod along with her. Ethan's blood roared in his ears. He could feel the stares tightening, a circle of silent witnesses complicit in their inaction. His jaw locked. His chest rose and fell with a controlled fury that begged release. And then it happened. His voice, low but carrying the unmistakable steel of a man who had been underestimated for too long, broke the room's hum. He rose from his chair, the scrape of its legs against the marble echoing louder than the orchestra. His shadow fell long across the table, swallowing the sequins, the crystal, the smirks. His words came measured, each syllable vibrating through the chandeliers above. "Did you just laugh at my wife?" he said, his voice rising with a force that silenced forks midair. In front of this entire room, the question struck like a hammer. The ballroom froze. The string quartet faltered, a violin screeching against its bow, before dissolving into stunned silence. Conversations died instantly. Every face turned, locked on him. On her. On the woman in silver, whose smug expression faltered, as if she had been caught naked under a spotlight. Phones appeared in trembling hands, lenses rising to capture the moment they all sensed was about to define the evening, perhaps even the city's gossip for weeks to come. A hush spread, heavier than velvet, as if even the chandeliers leaned down to hear what would follow. Lena sat perfectly still, her hand still curled in her lap, her cheeks flushed not with shame but with the unbearable pressure of hundreds of eyes upon her. She had not cried, would not cry, but Ethan saw the sheen of unshed tears that spoke louder than sobs. He looked at her then, not at the crowd, not at the laughing woman, but at his wife, the woman who had given him courage when his empire crumbled, who had stood beside him when friends scattered like leaves in the wind. And he realized in that charged instant that everything they thought they had taken from him, his power, his influence, his place at the table meant nothing compared to what they could never take. His voice, his will, and his ability to defend her dignity with the full force of his being. The room waited, breath held, the silence a living thing. Ethan's words, though only a single question, reverberated through every corner, demanding an answer not just from the woman in silver, but from everyone present. For years they had laughed behind his back, whispered in corridors, speculated in magazines. Tonight, they had laughed in his face through his wife. And tonight, he would not let it pass. The silence that followed Ethan's question was not an ordinary pause. It was the kind of silence that presses down on a room, suffocating, demanding. Every eye in the ballroom was fixed on the confrontation unfolding at the long table. The woman in the sequin gown stiffened, her smirk evaporating as quickly as it had formed. Her painted lips parted as if to reply. But no sound came out. She glanced to her companions for support, but they had already lowered their gazes, suddenly fascinated by their plates. No one was willing to align themselves with her now that the man she had mocked had risen to his full height. Ethan's voice had carried something no one expected. Not just anger, but authority. The kind of authority that lingered from years of commanding boardrooms and sealing contracts that shaped skylines. Though they had whispered about his decline, though they had written him off as a man past his prime, in that instant they remembered why they had once deferred to him. His question had not been a plea. It was an accusation, a demand for accountability. And accountability was a language most of them had long forgotten how to speak. The woman tried to laugh again, a nervous trill that fell flat in the cavernous hush. "It was just a joke," she muttered, but the words sounded pitiful, childish, even to her own ears. No one echoed her laughter this time. The champagne bubbles in her glass, went flat in the heavy air. We were only talking. No harm meant. No harm meant. The phrase twisted like a knife in Ethan's chest. He looked at Lena, his wife, his anchor, and saw the flush in her cheeks, the rigid way she held herself, as if bracing against invisible blows. He knew the harm was already done. These were not harmless words. They were daggers sharpened on years of prejudice, delivered with precision in front of an audience, meant to wound her dignity beyond repair. For the woman in silver, it was an evening's amusement. For Lena, it was humiliation she would carry long after the chandeliers dimmed. A murmur began at the far end of the room. Someone whispered, "Isn't that Ethan Ward?" The name rippled like an electric current. Recognition spread. Heads bent together. Phones lit under the tables, screens glowing with quick searches. Faces shifted as facts reassembled in their minds. The once celebrated CEO of Ward Enterprises, the man who had nearly lost everything in a corporate battle, now standing here, defending his wife against a socialite's cruelty. Some leaned forward with fascination, sensing they were witnessing something more than a spat. It was history repeating itself in a new theater. A fallen titan refusing to stay fallen. Ethan did not move from where he stood, his presence towering over the table, but his gaze swept the crowd. He saw the curiosity in their eyes, the hunger for spectacle. He despised it, yet he also knew how to use it. If they wanted theater, he would give them truth as the script. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his hands flat on the table. The polished wood reflected his image back at him, fractured by crystal goblets and half-eaten hors d'oeuvres. His voice, when it came again, was quieter than before, but so sharp it sliced through the silence. "When you laugh at her," he said, "you laugh at me. And when you dismiss her, you dismiss everything we have endured, everything we have built together. Do you think I will sit here and let that stand?" The woman's eyes widened. She opened her mouth, closed it again, her confidence unraveling thread by thread. Around her, diners shifted uncomfortably, caught between complicity and conscience. Some wanted to speak, to break the spell of silence, but the weight of Ethan's words pinned them down. No one dared intervene. It was as though the entire ballroom had become a courtroom, and Ethan's question had transformed them all into unwilling jurors. Lena finally lifted her gaze. Her dark eyes met Ethan's, steady now despite the flush on her cheeks. She gave the smallest shake of her head, a silent plea for him to sit, to let it go, to spare himself further humiliation. But Ethan knew that to sit down now would be to admit defeat, not just for himself but for her. They had survived storms together that would have sunk other marriages. Betrayal by partners, the collapse of fortune, the relentless sneer of the media. What was one woman's scorn compared to all that? And yet, it was different. It was public. It was intimate. It was aimed at the very core of Lena's belonging in his world, that he could not let pass. "Answer me," Ethan demanded, his eyes locking onto the woman in silver. "Did you laugh at my wife?" The repetition thundered louder than the orchestra had all night. This time, the woman flinched, shrinking into her chair, as though the sequins on her gown could no longer shield her. Her companions leaned back, as if trying to distance themselves from the blast radius of her folly. One muttered something about needing air, and stood quickly, abandoning her. It was Lena who broke the standoff. Her voice, soft yet resonant, carried across the stunned tables. "You don't need to answer," she said, addressing the woman but looking at Ethan. "We both heard it. Everyone here heard it. That's enough." Her dignity in that moment struck harder than any outburst could have. She was refusing to be reduced to victimhood. But Ethan saw what it cost her. He saw the way her hand trembled again, hidden under the tablecloth, and he knew the wound had been carved deep. The chandeliers glittered coldly above as if mocking the warmth that had left the room. The laughter, the music, the pretense of elegance gone. All that remained was the raw divide between cruelty and defiance, between those who looked away and the one man who refused to. Ethan straightened, his voice calm now, almost gentle, but carrying the finality of a verdict. "Then, let it be known," he said, "that the only shame tonight does not belong to my wife." The words hung in the air, undeniable. A few diners lowered their eyes in shame. Others whispered, guilty recognition dawning on them. The woman in silver remained frozen, her face pale, her sequins dull under the lights. Ethan reached down then, his hand finding Lena's. She hesitated, then allowed him to help her to her feet. Together they stood, a silent wall of solidarity in a room that had tried to make them small. And though the evening was far from over, the balance had already shifted. Ethan had reclaimed something essential, not wealth, not status, but voice, presence, truth. The manager of the hotel ballroom appeared then, a man in a tailored black suit whose polished shoes clicked nervously across the marble. His expression was tight, beads of sweat already forming along his hairline as he glanced between Ethan, Lena, and the woman in silver. He cleared his throat, his voice low, almost pleading. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "perhaps we could keep the evening civil. This is a charity event, after all. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings to overshadow the purpose of the night." The word misunderstanding ignited something in Ethan. He turned his gaze on the manager, not with fury but with a coldness sharper than any outburst. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated. "Tell me, what part of laughing at my wife, in front of 100 witnesses, is unclear to you?" The manager faltered, his eyes darting around as though seeking someone else to intervene, someone with more authority. But no one moved. The diners remained silent, caught between their discomfort and their fascination. The woman in silver tried to seize the opening, clutching her glass with trembling fingers. "Yes, exactly," she chimed in. "A misunderstanding. I meant no offense. We were only talking amongst ourselves, and perhaps I laughed too loudly. But truly, this is being blown out of proportion." Her words rang hollow, bouncing off the gilded walls without finding purchase. Even her companions, who had moments earlier leaned in eagerly to her barbed remarks, now avoided her eyes, their silence a quiet betrayal. Lena stood straighter beside Ethan, her hand tightening around his. "If that's what you call a misunderstanding," she said softly but clearly, "then you've never known what it feels like to be dismissed before you've even spoken. You laughed because you thought no one would call you on it, because you thought I wouldn't matter enough to answer back." The strength in her tone silenced even the clinking of glasses. There was no bitterness, only a clarity that cut deeper than accusation. The room shifted, diners glancing at one another, uncomfortable mirrors held up to their own complicity. Ethan watched the faces around him. He saw guilt flicker in some, defiance in others. But more than that, he saw the dawning realization that this was not just about a laugh, not just about one cruel remark. It was about the way entire rooms could decide, in unspoken agreement, who belonged and who did not. Tonight, that unspoken agreement had been shattered. The woman in silver's facade crumbled further. She set her glass down too quickly, the sharp clink betraying her nerves. I didn't know she was your wife," she stammered, her voice desperate now. "I didn't realize who she was." The excuse landed like a confession, exposing the rot beneath. The implication was clear. Had Lena been someone else, someone without Ethan at her side, the humiliation would have been acceptable. The crowd inhaled sharply as the words hung in the air. A few shook their heads. A couple of men muttered under their breath. The ugliness had been laid bare. Ethan leaned forward, his voice soft but deadly. "So, respect depends on recognition? Dignity is reserved only for those whose names you know? You didn't laugh because you thought she was unworthy. You laughed because you thought she was invisible. But she is not invisible. Not to me. Not to anyone who has the decency to look beyond themselves. His words fell like a gavel. For a moment, even the chandeliers seemed to dim. The woman's composure shattered completely. Her hand shook as she reached for her napkin, pressing it against her lips as if to stop more disastrous words from spilling out. The audience, once complicit, now shifted uneasily in their seats. Some nodded subtly, in agreement with Ethan. Others whispered behind raised hands. The tide had turned, and the glittering room that once excluded him now bore witness to his defiance. Ethan straightened slowly, his hand never leaving Lena's. He felt the warmth of her grip, the silent strength she had always given him. Tonight, she had been mocked for her simplicity, but he saw her now more clearly than ever. The quiet resilience, the courage to endure humiliation without surrendering her dignity. He realized he was not just defending her. He was standing beside her, in a battle that belonged to both of them. And though the night was far from over, the balance had already shifted. The laughter had stopped. The sneers had curdled into silence. And in that silence, Ethan reclaimed not just his voice, but hers. The woman in silver slumped back into her chair, her face drained of color, her sequins suddenly looking cheap under the bright chandeliers. Around her, the silence thickened, broken only by the faint shuffle of waiters unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Somewhere near the back, a camera phone's shutter clicked. The sound was small, almost apologetic, yet it carried like a gunshot across the tense stillness. Others followed, hands moving without hesitation. The scene was no longer just for those inside the ballroom. It was being captured, documented, prepared to be retold far beyond these four walls. Ethan noticed, but did not care. He was past the point of calculation. For too long, he had allowed whispers and stares to gnaw at the edges of his life. Tonight, the mockery had been aimed not at him, but at Lena, and that line could not be crossed without consequence. He looked at the woman again, her hands twisting in her lap, her lips pressed thin, as if she could hold back the unraveling. She had built her confidence on the assumption that the room was hers, that no one would dare confront her cruelty. Now she was trapped in the very spotlight she had created. Lena stood silently at his side, her chin slightly lifted. She had not spoken again, but her presence was enough. Ethan felt her strength ripple through the fragile stillness. She was not broken by the insult, only bruised. Yet that bruise was his to answer for, and he would not let it fester. He stepped closer to the table, the weight of his presence pressing down on the woman in silver. "You thought no one would notice," he said evenly, his voice reaching every corner of the room. "But everyone noticed. They heard you. They saw you, and now they see you for what you are." The woman flinched. "Please," she whispered, the word breaking from her throat like a plea. "I didn't mean—" But Ethan cut her off with a raised hand. "You didn't mean to get caught," he said. "You didn't mean for your mask to slip. But the truth always shows itself in the end." His words struck harder than anger could have. They carried a calm certainty that left no room for denial. The crowd shifted uneasily, some exchanging glances that spoke of their own guilt, their own small cruelties delivered in other rooms, other nights. The mirror had been turned, and they did not like what it showed. The manager, pale and sweating, tried again to salvage the evening. "Mr. Ward," he said carefully, "perhaps it would be best to—" Ethan's eyes snapped to him, sharp enough to slice through his sentence. "Best for whom?" he asked, his tone dangerously quiet. "For her? For you? Or for every person here who would rather pretend nothing happened than admit what they saw?" The manager's mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer. He lowered his eyes, shame spreading across his face. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, an elderly man at a table near the stage rose to his feet. His gray hair caught the golden light as he straightened, his cane steady in his hand. "I saw everything," he said, his voice carrying clearly, strong despite his years. "Your wife was treated with cruelty she did not deserve, and you," his eyes shifted to the woman in silver, "should be ashamed." His words cracked the silence like glass. A murmur of agreement followed, hesitant at first, then stronger. A woman, at another table, nodded. A man set down his fork with finality and muttered, "Disgraceful." The tide, once hidden beneath jeweled smiles and polite indifference, began to turn. The woman in silver shrank in her chair, the sparkle of her dress no longer dazzling but glaring, like a harsh light revealing flaws. She tried to speak again, but the words died on her tongue. Her allies had deserted her. The room she had counted on to validate her cruelty had abandoned her to the judgment she had invited on herself. And Ethan, standing tall with Lena's hand still clasped in his, knew the power had shifted entirely. He was no longer the fallen man whispered about in shadows. He was the man who had reclaimed his voice in front of them all. The man who had demanded dignity and received it. Not only for himself, but for his wife. The silence now was no longer against him. It was for him. It was waiting, watching, expecting. Ethan held that silence a moment longer, letting it settle, letting the weight of it press down on every corner of the room. Then he drew in a slow breath and said, "Remember this night. Remember what you chose to laugh at. And remember what it cost you." The applause did not come, but the silence deepened into something heavier, more dangerous. The room seemed to lean in, hundreds of eyes waiting to see whether Ethan would relent or whether the woman in silver would try to reclaim her ground. She straightened suddenly, her face pale, yet hardening with defiance. The corners of her mouth lifted into a brittle smile, the kind that dared others to disagree. "You're overreacting," she said loudly, projecting her voice across the tables. "This entire scene, it's unnecessary. Everyone knows galas like this are about appearances. If your wife can't handle a little banter, perhaps she doesn't belong here." The words rippled outward, bold and venomous. A few gasps sounded. Some faces turned away, unwilling to be caught reacting. Others leaned forward, hungry for conflict. The woman had chosen her strategy. If she could not retreat with grace, she would double down with arrogance. Her allies might have abandoned her, but her pride was not so easily surrendered. She clung to it like armor, even as it cracked under the weight of her own desperation. Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Lena's voice rose, steady and calm. "Belonging isn't something you decide for me," she said. Her words carried clearly, each syllable deliberate. "You laugh because you think that gives you power. But power built on ridicule is nothing but weakness in disguise." Her voice did not tremble. If anything, it grew stronger with each word, echoing across the marble and crystal, until even the waiters froze mid-step to listen. The woman's face flushed crimson, her brittle smile collapsing. "Weakness?" she spat. "You think you can lecture me about weakness, standing here in a dress worth less than the shoes on my feet?" She lifted her sequined sleeve as if to display her wealth like a weapon. The attempt was pitiful, transparent, yet her voice rose higher, shrill with panic. "This entire room knows who matters, and it isn't you." Ethan stepped forward, his presence eclipsing her. His hand still held Lena's, but his voice cut through the woman's tirade like steel. "You want to talk about who matters?" His gaze swept the room, locking eyes with diners one by one, daring them to look away. "It isn't measured in sequins or champagne. It isn't bought with money or borrowed names. It's measured in dignity, in character, in the way you treat people when no one can stop you. And tonight, everyone saw your measure." The woman tried to protest, but her words choked in her throat as the murmurs in the room shifted. No longer neutral, no longer hesitant. They carried judgment now. Quiet, yes, but undeniable. People were choosing sides, and for the first time, she realized hers was empty. The glittering gowns, the tuxedos, the polished shoes, none of it shielded her from the truth laid bare under the chandeliers. Ethan didn't need to shout. He didn't need to rage. His calm was more devastating than anger. "You thought we didn't belong here," he said, his voice low, but carrying. "But tonight, it's you who doesn't." The words struck with finality, as if the marble itself had sealed them in stone. The crowd murmured again, louder this time. Some nodded. Some frowned at the woman with open disdain. The shift was complete. The social order she had counted on had crumbled around her, leaving her exposed, fragile, and alone. Lena squeezed his hand gently, and Ethan felt the tremor of relief ripple through her. For the first time that night, she looked at him not with fear of humiliation, but with the pride of standing beside someone who refused to let her dignity be trampled. Together they stood, unbroken, while the woman in silver crumbled in the very spotlight she had sought to control. The spell of silence shattered when another voice rose from the far side of the ballroom. It was sharp, male, dripping with disdain. "Enough of this," he barked. Heads turned quickly. A man in a black tuxedo, tall and heavy-set, pushed back his chair with a screech. His face was flushed with anger, or perhaps embarrassment, as he strode toward the table. He was her husband. Everyone knew him, Harold Fairfax, property mogul, a name etched across half the billboards in the city. He had been speaking with donors only minutes before, sipping vintage cognac as if he owned the night. Now his jaw clenched so tightly the veins stood out in his temple. The woman in silver visibly shrank in her chair as he loomed over her. "Do you realize what you've done?" he hissed, his voice low but audible enough for those nearest to hear. "You've humiliated me. You've humiliated us." She opened her mouth, but he cut her off, his finger stabbing the air toward Ethan. "And this is a charity gala, not your stage. Don't think you can grandstand here and turn my wife into your punching bag." Ethan did not flinch. He turned his shoulders to face Harold fully, his posture relaxed but unyielding. "Your wife turned herself into a spectacle," he said calmly. "I only refused to let my wife become her victim." His words carried no venom, only the kind of clarity that stripped away pretense. The crowd held its collective breath. Harold's fists curled, his eyes narrowing into slits. He was used to control, to intimidation, to silence bought with fear. But tonight, the weight of 100 witnesses pinned him down. He could not bully his way past the truth that already hung heavy in the air. The hotel manager, sweating more profusely now, darted between them. "Gentlemen, please, let's not—" But Harold shoved his hand aside with a snarl. "Do you know who I am?" he thundered, his voice booming across the ballroom. "Do you know what happens when you cross me?" The words, intended as a threat, backfired. A ripple of disapproval ran through the guests. A woman at a nearby table muttered, "Pathetic." Someone else whispered, "This is worse than the laugh." The tide was no longer with him. He had stepped into the same trap his wife had laid for herself, arrogance, amplified under the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. Lena stood straighter, her fingers tightening around Ethan's hand. She had said little since the confrontation began, but her presence radiated quiet power. Ethan drew strength from it. He met Harold's glare without blinking. "Yes," he said softly, "we all know who you are, and now we know who she is. But tonight, everyone here will also remember who stood silent when cruelty was paraded in front of them, and who did not." The words landed with the weight of judgment. Harold's face darkened, his rage sputtering against the reality that no one in the room moved to defend him. Even his business associates avoided his eyes, their loyalty dissolving in the face of scandal. His wife, still seated, clutched her sequined dress as though it could shield her from the shame clinging to her like smoke. For years they had ruled these rooms with their wealth and influence. Tonight, stripped of applause and affirmation, they looked small. Phones captured every second. Guests who had stayed silent now had the courage of anonymity behind their screens. Tomorrow, the city would wake to headlines, not about the charity's cause, but about the Fairfax's disgrace. Their names would be etched in whispers, not in marble. Their empire, built on image, had cracked under the weight of truth spoken aloud. Ethan did not smile, did not gloat. He simply took Lena's hand in his, steady and sure, and guided her away from the table. As they moved toward the exit, the room parted like water before them. Eyes followed, not with mockery now, but with a quiet reverence. The balance had shifted irrevocably. The laughter had turned to silence, and silence had turned to witness. In that witness lay a verdict the Fairfaxes would never escape. The night air outside was cool, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the manicured hedges lining the hotel's grand entrance. Ethan and Lena stepped out together, the heavy doors closing behind them with a muffled thud, sealing off the murmurs and flashes of the ballroom. For the first time that evening, Lena exhaled fully, her breath trembling as it left her. She leaned into Ethan's arm, not in weakness, but in relief. The humiliation had not crushed her, it had revealed who truly stood at her side, and the entire city had seen it. Valets straightened hurriedly as the couple emerged, recognizing Ethan though none dared speak. A black sedan purred forward, headlights glinting against the marble steps. Ethan opened the door for Lena, but before she stepped inside, she turned back toward the glowing windows of the ballroom. From within, the faint echo of voices still carried voices raised not in laughter now, but in restless judgment. The woman in silver would not escape them. Neither would her husband. Their names, once whispered with envy, would be whispered with scorn. Lena's hand brushed Ethan's, her voice low but steady. "You didn't have to do that," she said. But he shook his head, his eyes never leaving hers. "Yes," he replied quietly. "I did, because silence makes you complicit, and I will never be complicit in your humiliation." She searched his face, and in his gaze she found no anger now, only an unshakable certainty. The certainty of a man who had once lost everything the world thought mattered and had discovered what truly did. As the car pulled away, the city lights unfolded before them, glittering against the night sky. Ethan leaned back, his arm around Lena's shoulders, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally ebbing. But deep inside, something had shifted. He no longer felt the sting of exclusion, the weight of being diminished in rooms that once applauded him. Tonight had stripped away the illusion of their power. What remained was clarity. Dignity is not granted by others. It is claimed and defended, even when the room turns against you. Behind them, the ballroom would buzz for hours, phones buzzing with videos, conversations dissecting every word, every expression. By morning, the Fairfaxes' downfall would be the city's scandal. Their wealth would shield them from ruin, perhaps, but not from the ridicule they had so freely dealt to others. For once, they would taste the bitterness of being diminished. And Ethan, walking into the night with his wife's hand clasped firmly in his, knew they would never again see him as invisible. They would see him as the man who stood up, who spoke when silence was easier, who reminded them all, at a gala meant to flaunt appearances that appearances crumble, but truth endures. The city glowed, indifferent to triumph or disgrace. But for Ethan and Lena, the night had marked a turning point. They no longer needed the approval of chandeliers and whispered titles. They had faced the cruelty of a room that tried to erase them and had walked out whole. And though no applause followed them into the night, the victory was theirs, the kind of victory that cannot be taken back, not by laughter, not by power, not by silence.